Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein isn't the only person who reportedly considered secretly recording President Trump. Former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara, this guy, revealed that he, too, considered secretly taping the president after a series of unorthodox phone calls that Trump made to the federal prosecutor before and after he took office. In a new interview with Ari Melber, Bharara describes the mistrust and unease that he felt about those interactions with Trump that led him to weigh recording a phone conversation with the president in March of 2017. He decided against it. He never returned Trump's call. 2 days later, Trump fired him. And while Rosenstein has denied that his comments about taping the president were serious, Bharara maintains it would be a reasonable thing to consider.
In that moment, we actually considered, and it sounds not as crazy as it did back then, because now we know about Michael Cohen recording the president and Omarosa recording the president. We considered, and we have this competing.
You considered what?
Taping the president in that phone call.
You considered recording the president if you had called him back?
Yeah, because I wanted to make sure, because I had a certain amount of mistrust, it was an odd phone call to be making. It would be my word against him if he decided to say something inappropriate, which I didn't necessarily know was going to happen.
I mean, this isn't in the book. This is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's why this whole debate about whether Rod Rosenstein was joking when he said, I'll wire up against the president or not, sort of rung in my ear a little bit. And I tend to believe that he was not joking, because there has been a certain kind of conduct that happens. And when you're used to seeing someone, tell untruths about what happens in a conversation, and you care about your own integrity, I don't want anybody to say, you had some side conversation with the President of the United States. It's something we discussed and talked about, did not think it was appropriate, did not think it was the right thing to do.
But when Rod Rosenstein discussed that in a meeting, your point is that is the kind of thing that you think prosecutors can legitimately discuss?
I think as a general matter, so long as it doesn't violate some law, and in New York it wouldn't violate a law. If you have a concern, and we all know people like this, a concern that someone will not be truthful about the conversation later, or you want to protect both the integrity of your own reputation and another person's reputation, there are a number of things that you do. You know that you're a practicing lawyer. You either take contemporaneous notes, as we know that virtually everyone who's dealt with the president does, or you think about a recording. I want to make clear, we talked about it for 3 or 4 minutes and then said, that's crazy, I'm not going to record the President of the United States. And we decided not to call.
Did you have anyone check the legal authority for it?
We discussed it among ourselves and thought it's not a proper thing to do, so we didn't. I think the interesting part of it was that was an impulse that we had, and ultimately decided the best thing to do is not to return the call until we know what it's about. And I returned the call of the secretary and said, oh, by the way, I did that after also consulting with Jeff Sessions' chief of staff, and said, you agree with me, do you not, that it's odd and inappropriate for me to have a direct conversation with the president?
And did you get any guidance back that you thought was helpful or valid from them?
Yeah, they were in total agreement.
So Trump's own appointed DOJ folks said, yeah, don't call the president.
Yeah, until you know what it's about, and until we can figure out whether it's proper or not. His own appointed people realized this is not going to look good for the president. If it looks like the president was reaching out, as now we know he has done on other occasions by telling Jim Comey once in a private conversation to lay off of Michael Flynn, conversations he apparently had more recently with the acting Attorney General Matt Whitaker about getting my successor to unrecuse himself from the Michael Cohen case. These are the kinds of conversations that have happened since, and reporting that's happened since, that make me more comfortable with the decision I made not to return the call.
It's kind of wild. Joining me now, Ari Melber, MSNBC's chief legal correspondent, the host of The Beat. He interviewed Preet Bharara earlier this evening on the show, and Tim O'Brien is back with us. Ari, what do you make of that? I mean, that is just, it's wild. It makes sense when Preet Bharara says it, and by the way, we've got recordings of other people having said similar things. But it's highly unusual for United States attorneys to worry about taping their conversation with the President of the United States because he might misrepresent the conversation.
Number one, it's significant because it shows a career prosecutor looking at the president as a potential subject trying to interfere with the probe. Number two, as Mr. Bharara told us here in this interview tonight, it's significant because it sheds new light on Rod Rosenstein's state of mind and whether that was something to discredit him, as some critics and Trump allies have posited, or whether it actually is a view that many people who were behind the scenes dealing with this president in the middle of these probes held. You heard Mr. Bharara say for himself, he thinks Rod Rosenstein was dead serious. And the idea that you could push back on that explosive New York Times story by saying it was sarcastic was more some type of cover. And number three, whatever happened, and they didn't ultimately decide to record it, they decided not to call him back, and as you reported, he got fired along with others. it is a reminder that Donald Trump has been obsessing over SDNY long before it was on the news, long before this is something that news junkies and political junkies have learned about.
Which begs the question as to why.
What did Donald Trump do or know? That before he was picking cabinet officers, Preet was walking in the lobby, as you showed, and then that he was calling him throughout the transition, and then calling him in March before the U.S. attorney firings and ultimately the Comey firing, which led to a special counsel.
So to our viewers who don't know what you're getting at, what would Donald Trump have known? What would he have been concerned about? What are the possibilities of what Donald Trump could have been worrying about that would cause him to call Preet Bharara?
A lot of what you had in the top of the show. A lot of whatever he thinks went down in the jurisdiction of Manhattan and Trump Tower, or other dealings he has, or other financial exposure he has, or whatever it was they got out of Michael Cohen's office that's still redacted, or whether he had some inkling that the 2016 campaign payments, which he has not been charged for, but Michael Cohen confessed to, had legal exposure. Only Donald Trump knows why he was fixated on SDNY. And Bharara also told me in that interview, and I appreciate you playing such a lengthy part of it. I think it's interesting what Bharara says. He also told me Barack Obama put him in this post. He served it for 8 years. He said they never had a one-on-one.
Unbelievable. But so I was going to ask you how unusual that is, that he would do that. But I want to play, you mentioned Rod Rosenstein. So I want to play what Andrew McCabe said in a 60 Minutes interview talking about Rosenstein wanting to record Donald Trump. Let's listen to that together.
The Deputy Attorney General offered to wear a wire into the White House. He said, I never get searched when I go into the White House. I could easily wear a recording device. They wouldn't know it was there. Now, he was not joking. He was absolutely serious, and in fact, he brought it up in the next meeting we had. The reason you would have someone wear a concealed recording device would be to collect evidence. And in this case, what was the true nature of the president's motivation in calling for the firing of Jim Comey?
And that's another part of this question, right? What's the motivation for him wanting to talk to Preet Bharara? What was the motivation for him then firing Jim Comey? The president's actions as it relates to lawyers in the Department of Justice and prosecutors raise more questions than they answer.
Well, look, there's two communities in the United States that still know more than most average Americans about what happened during Trump's presidential campaign and thereafter, the intelligence community and the law enforcement community. And both of those communities had ample reason to be alarmed by information that they were gathering, the full scope of which we still don't know. And all of these people, I think, were doing what they entered these jobs to do, which is to enforce the law and protect the national security of the United States. It is good practice in a situation like that to gather evidence that can't be disputed. Tape recordings go to that quite directly. Reporters did it. I had 2 years of exposure to Trump. I recorded a large portion of our interactions for exactly this reason. People who worked for Donald Trump, Michael Cohen and Omarosa, taped him because they suspected he was taping them.
Although, as you say, you did it for your reasons, we are being told prosecutors never do this to their bosses.
Well, but that's the thing, is that their concern here is that their boss isn't acting as a distant and fair-minded manager of the law enforcement process and the judiciary.
Or they might be involved in the very law enforcement process. They might be a subject of something.
They feel they were very aware. Trump had just fired Jim Comey. So you had the FBI and the Justice Department rattled by that and trying to figure out the best course of responding to that. Perhaps they made mistakes, but I think what they were trying to do was come up with a record that could not be disputed as they tried to understand what was going on here. Preet Bharara also had the distinct advantage of being a New Yorker. And New Yorkers who were exposed to Trump for decades before he ran for president knew exactly how he rolled. So Bharara is coming at this from both being a New Yorker and a law enforcement official. And they all had good reasons for wanting to have tape recordings.
And Bharara was in Trump Tower during the transition and got a sense of Donald Trump's state of mind and the few other aides around him of why he was so interested in SDNY. And he got the other phone calls. Right. And Bharara confirmed for me tonight there are no records of Donald Trump calling other prosecutors.
So this is what I was wondering. When he
place.
said that, I remember at the time when he got fired, it's saying that he had to consult someone. He didn't think it was appropriate to call the president. Lay people like me don't know that it wouldn't be appropriate for the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York to talk to the president or the Attorney General or anybody else to be talking to the president.
And here's the reason why. You raise a great question, Ali. It's the operational equivalent of lock her up. That's big talk on the campaign that people thought was inappropriate.
Right.
Operationally, though, what's worse than yelling "lock her up" in private?
Asking
in public is calling in private and trying to cultivate these relationships, to bring these people in, and to also potentially make them seem so locked in with Trump that whether they like it or not, they're
compromised,
they're compromised, or they might be, or they have to defend things. And again, why was Donald Trump so obsessed with this? Rachel has reported on her show about when it came to the hiring. He took this acute interest in the prosecutors in Florida, where there's also jurisdiction, and D.C. And so the narrative that Donald Trump is bumbling and doesn't know anything runs into the idea, and that he doesn't have a lot of interest in staffing government agencies, runs into the idea that when it involves his criminal exposure, he suddenly has a acute interest.
You know, you only need two lenses to understand almost everything Donald Trump does. That's either self-aggrandizement or self-preservation. And everything that's happened around the law enforcement process is about self-preservation. And we now have a fact pattern that's emerged. Michael Cohen has been prosecuted in the Southern District for a number of crimes. The New York State Attorney General has investigated the Trump Foundation for being a sham. They're looking into Trump's relationships with Deutsche Bank. Trump had to anticipate that once he entered the White House, some of this stuff was coming, and I think he had
You said self-aggrandizement?
Or self-preservation.
Or self-preservation.
Yeah.
There may be a third self, and that is playing yourself.
Right.
Because the way that Donald Trump has attacked law enforcement and fired officials and removed James Comey, that's what led to the special counsel that's haunted him and has indicted more aides than any probe.
So his instinct
at this point
may
in
have
the history of any presidency. So the question is, did he ultimately play himself?
Had he not done a bunch of these things, there would be no Robert Mueller and there would be no special counsel. Guys, great interview. Thank you, Ari. I've been thinking all through this interview about some rap lyric to quote to you, and I have come up short. So another time. Tim,
maybe next time.
Maybe there is always a next time. Tim O'Brien and Ari Melber.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.